Good morning, dear friends. My name is Igor Yakovenko. Today, February 19th, in Kiev, it is 7 hours 44 minutes. We continue our morning reflections about what is happening in Russia, in the world, in Ukraine, and in our souls. Well, I would say it's a nasty piece of news. Not exactly bad, just very unpleasant. The national anthem of Russia and the Russian flag will be featured once again at the Paralympic Games for the first time since 2014. The reality of the situation is that this has been ongoing ever since the Sochi Games. At first, the main reason for the total absence of the Russian flag and their national anthem at the Paralympic Games was quite clear. It was due to the widespread doping scandal. This was then further compounded by the heavy international sanctions following the outbreak of the Great War in 2022. As we are all well aware by now, at the 2026 Winter Olympic Games, there were a total of 13 Russian athletes, but they actually participated in the events as neutral athletes, as these individual neutral athletes. But right here, this is exactly what ended up happening. So, naturally, Ukraine declared its protest. Naturally, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Andrei Sybiha, formally called for a boycott of the opening and the entire opening ceremony. Themselves, so to speak, the Ukrainian officials will not be present at this event. Well, overall, the situation is indeed scandalous. As far as I can understand, well, as the saying goes, every single one of us, people can say whatever they want. Naturally, I also haven't seen any official payment slips myself, but I have a very strong feeling that these officials, especially the sports officials, well, they suddenly and quite unexpectedly became abruptly wealthy as a direct result of all this. So the entire situation is very unpleasant for everyone involved in it. What could be called the most significant piece of news is the conclusion of the trilateral negotiations in Geneva. But this is not really news, since there were no concrete results. The primary takeaway from the meeting is the decision, or rather the intention, to continue these negotiations. In other words, they met and simply agreed to keep talking in the future. There were two groups there, the military and the political. So the military group, as always, was very successful. Everything went really well. They practically agreed, well, again, this is according to Ukrainian President Zelensky, that they practically agreed on a mechanism for a ceasefire. This is the specific segment of the meeting where Lieutenant General Budanov and Admiral Postyukov were engaged in high-level negotiations. Well, naturally, it is considerably more straightforward in this setting to reach a mutual agreement on exactly how the ceasefire mechanism will be implemented from a comprehensive military technical perspective. But as for the political part, there has been no progress at all, for obvious reasons. Because, well, you can express any opinion you might have about the clown Medinsky, but the fundamental issue that we are facing is that this clown simply does not have the authority to make any real decisions. The key to the political part of the negotiations is it is kept in Putin's pocket or a safe, and he has no intention of taking this key out. What is truly so remarkable is that after the negotiations had already ended, so Medinsky, he held a completely separate and private meeting with both Rustem Umarov and David Arakami. As far as I can understand from the situation and judging by what has been reported in the press, this was an entirely impromptu and unscheduled meeting. That is to say, Medinsky stayed behind after the formal conclusion of the main part of the negotiations, at a time when a significant part of the Ukrainian delegation had already departed from the scene. The head of the delegation, Rustem Umarov, stayed behind, as did Arakamiya. And so, in the end, this kind of quite impromptu round ended up taking place. So, as far as I understand, the conversation lasted for approximately an hour and a half over there. There were no serious results either. That is, well, I've written it down for myself, something like this. Here, the advisor to the president of Ukraine on communications, Dmytro Litvin, told journalists that the meeting between the Ukrainian representatives and Medinsky definitely should not be considered as some kind of separate format. This person himself, he's talking about Medinsky, expressed a desire to meet additionally. There were certain clarifying points regarding what had been discussed earlier. Nothing special. So, and he confirms, Litvin himself confirms that Medinsky approached the Ukrainian representatives when part of the Ukrainian delegation had already left. So they talked, and Litvin says that in the end there was nothing substantive and asks not to make Medinsky out to be someone he is not, as if he has something special or parallel going on. Well, quite obviously, the simple fact that Medinsky is just a clown and doesn't actually decide anything at all is perfectly clear. And the fact that he distracted the head of the Ukrainian negotiating delegation, David Arakamia, for a full hour and a half is, of course, quite unpleasant, but it remains ultimately tolerable. So, what else? During the negotiations, it was also discussed, as is known from the press. They discussed the idea of a demilitarized zone in the Donetsk region, which would not be controlled by either the Ukrainian armed forces or the Russian occupation army. That is, naturally, we're talking about the territory of the region currently controlled by Ukraine. So, well, honestly, it's hard for me to even imagine. It's clear that achieving this is entirely possible. So I believe this aligns with Donald Trump's core idea, his famous slogan that international trade is the best way to end a war. And in this specific context, there's this broader idea of establishing a comprehensive free trade zone. Trade, you see? So, in these destroyed cities, in the cities of the Donetsk region, there will be a designated free trade zone established. That is, they'll set up stalls and start trading. That's it. So, another idea, which I think is completely unworkable and in some ways even insane, is to create a civil administration in the demilitarized zone that will govern the region, this entire territory following the conclusion of the conflict. Supposedly, official representatives and delegates from both Ukraine and Russia could be actively involved in the oversight of this administration. I simply cannot imagine such an administrative structure for governing a territory or for governing a specific region. Well, I don't know. Maybe some of you, my dear friends, possess a far more vivid imagination than I do. I'll step aside here. I honestly find it quite difficult to imagine official representatives from both Ukraine and Russia sitting down together at the same table and discussing how they might organize daily life in what is, well, essentially an occupied territory. So, yes, it is hard to see. To confirm what I am saying, there was actually a specific statement from Yuri Ushakov, that KGB guy who serves as Putin's advisor on international affairs, or to be more precise, his assistant for international affairs, excuse me for that correction. So, the core of his proposal revolves around the idea that this demilitarized zone can only exist if members of the Russian police force or units of the Russian National Guard are able to effectively control this zone within the designated borders. Well, that's it, the loophole has been left open. Essentially, it's still about surrendering the territory. In other words, Ukraine is simply supposed to hand over this territory to Russia, and the fact that it would be called a demilitarized zone if there are Russian National Guard fighters there. What difference does it make who exactly will control this territory? Ukraine has stated that it is only willing to consider this complex issue if international peacekeeping forces are officially deployed within this demilitarized zone. That is essentially all there is to the matter right now. Furthermore, according to official reports from Ukraine, around 190,000 people currently live in this territory, including 12,000 children. And honestly, overall, I can hardly imagine how Ukraine would agree to give up these territories. But what should be done? That's 190,000 people. These are people who are now sitting and wondering what they should do at all. Should they already be fleeing, or is it not time yet? Or should they urgently, so to speak, change sides and become Russians in advance? That's the situation. But it really must be emphasized that when we discuss the details of this trilateral negotiation process, it is a complete and total dead end. It's an absolutely obvious dead end, and everyone understands this. And I'm afraid that, well, I don't know if Trump understands it. And maybe he's just pretending to be an idiot, but everyone understands that this is a dead end, that there will be no peace here. But there is also another negotiation process, a parallel one, which is ongoing all the time, and it's being conducted by completely different people. Or rather, Ukraine is not involved in this negotiation process at all. Europe is not involved in this either. These negotiations are currently being conducted by specially selected business people from among both Russians and Americans. On the Russian side, these negotiations are, by the way, apparently a bit more successful overall. They are led by Dmitriev. On the American side, naturally, it's Vitek and Zitek. By the way, yesterday in our conversation, Mikhail Pavlovich Shedelman mentioned that, as it turns out, and I actually didn't know this, but it turns out that, well, these nicknames, Vitek and Zitek, have already acquired international status. That is to say, much like certain well-known Russian words, Sputnik and pogrom, for example. They eventually became just like the term perestroika, they became fully international terms, while remaining in their original Russian transcription. In this particular instance, Vitek and Zitek as well, these are the pseudonyms of these two remarkable people. They have achieved a significant level of international recognition. So, what exactly is this fascinating story all about? The point is that between constantly parallel to these ongoing negotiations and diplomatic conversations, another significant and separate process is taking place. This is a strictly non-public and highly confidential process between the Kremlin and the White House, where the specific details of Trump's bribe are being discussed. A staggering $12 trillion in exchange for the easing of international sanctions. At this point, I must refer to two primary sources. First, this is information from Ukrainian intelligence, which was recently mentioned by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. Second, it is the recent publication in The Economist, where it is reported that Trump is being offered the greatest deal ever offered. Again, this reflects that same anchorage spirit, and this is that absolutely insane figure of $12 trillion. This massive amount significantly exceeds all expectations. Multiple times greater than Russia's entire yearly national budget. So we're really talking about, well, it's precisely this publication in The Economist. It emphasizes the complete and utter fabrication, that is, the fakeness of this figure. There are no sources that add up to anything like this, absolutely nothing that even comes close to 12 trillion. So what we're talking about, all of these various meetings, well, there were actually about a dozen different meetings. Vitka and Kremlovsky, known as the Fixer, and Dmitriev held meetings where these 12 trillion rubles were discussed in great detail. There, the conversation focused on participation in major Russian energy assets, specifically large scale projects for oil and gas development in the Arctic region, the extraction of valuable rare earth metals, and various construction efforts. They even mentioned some kind of specialized nuclear energy center. Again, they brought up the wonderful, ambitious idea of a strait under the Bering. Actually, sorry, I misspoke. I meant a massive transport tunnel under the Bering Strait. We should probably actually discuss this as part of a stand up comedy routine because what are people really going to do when they come out? You know? To this tunnel and find themselves in Chukotka, what are they supposed to do next? That's it. So, well, anyone who has been to Chukotka understands the absurdity of this idea. You come out there and then what? Well, a bear looks at you with interest. If you're really lucky, you might meet a person there. But you have to survive until then. It's just absolute madness. So, besides that, Putin is currently offering Donald Trump the full return of various assets worth a staggering $5 trillion that were originally seized back in 2022. Well, to put it quite simply, this massive sum of money they're talking about, this $12 million, is entirely fabricated and absolute nonsense. But for someone like Trump, the amount sounds incredibly impressive. It's kind of like, well, when you really stop to think about it, this is the Peace Council that he headed. $12 trillion, which certainly wouldn't be a bad little addition to his retirement fund. So, just how realistic is a scenario like this? Well, when you look at the situation, to seriously entertain the notion of Putin being able to buy Trump and, so to speak, secure the lifting of international sanctions, that is also nothing more than pure fantasy. Because in order to lift the sanctions, and keep in mind there are literally thousands and thousands of them currently in effect, first of all, there are also European sanctions. And second, to lift the sanctions, you need a decision from Congress. So, in short, I have become firmly convinced that what we are currently dealing with here is a parallel negotiation process being conducted by Bessia. That is to say, it's essentially more or less the same as Medinsky and Witkov are hitting a complete stalemate on the issue of peace. In exactly the same way, I believe that the economic negotiations also have no realistic prospects for success. The simple reason for this is that, on Russia's side, it is nothing more than a strategic bluff. And on the side of the United States, it is merely a question of what they can offer in exchange for a bribe. Even if this bribe is significantly more modest in scale, it is still not something that falls within Trump's prerogative. After all, it is important to remember that, unlike Vladimir Putin, he is not an autocrat. Furthermore, another significant event that became known yesterday is the official publication of a major in-depth interview alongside the former commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, General Valery Zaluzhny, who is now serving as Ukraine's ambassador to the United Kingdom, as reported in the Associated Press. It seems to me to be quite an important publication. The publication continues. There has been a noticeable and growing trend lately of people constantly drawing sharp contrasts between General Zaluzhny and President Zelensky. And to be perfectly honest, this is really the first time we are seeing such a public discourse emerge so frankly. Valery Zaluzhny directly accuses President Zelensky. To begin with, we must consider the situation involving the organization of provocative searches within the office of the Commander-in-Chief. This specific event refers back to the events from September of 2022. Well, indeed, the situation is absolutely scandalous. At that very specific moment, there were, so to speak, several foreign military advisors present in General Zaluzhny's private office. At that exact same time, high-ranking representatives from the security service of Ukraine entered the room. Supposedly, they had already obtained a formal legal warrant for the purpose of conducting a search in some local strip club. It is quite difficult to imagine that the various employees of the security service of Ukraine did not see or know about this situation, for a significant amount of time now. Located directly on the grounds of this former strip club is the official residence of the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. This is really something that you could only ever talk about in a stand-up comedy style, which, of course, I definitely will not do. But the situation is absolutely scandalous. Back at that particular time, Zaluzhny threatened that he would simply call on the entire army to protect both himself and his administrative office. In the end, it resulted in absolutely nothing except for a huge public scandal and, quite obviously, the complete destruction of their relationship, of the atmosphere of trust between the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine and President Zelensky. And in addition to all that, furthermore, the second major accusation comes from General Valery Zaluzhny, who has claimed that President Zelensky essentially ruined the entire summer offensive campaign. According to the general, the president's specific actions ended up disrupting the original strategic plans and military objectives that had been carefully put in place by the High Command. We're talking about the counteroffensive by the armed forces of Ukraine in 2023. From what I have been able to gather, the idea was this. Zaluzhny's idea was to concentrate the forces, the full strength of all available military forces, and completely liberate the entire Zaporizhzhia region, and then successfully reach the shores of the Sea of Azov. But by the direct order of Commander-in-Chief Zelensky, the Ukrainian army's forces were spread thin across multiple fronts, and there simply weren't enough resources available. As for who is right or who is wrong in this situation, I definitely do not intend to offer any personal commentary or make any definitive judgments about that. I think that in any case, after the war is over, there will be a thorough discussion of these issues, but only after the war. And right now, it is absolutely clear to me that in one way or another, it seems that an attempt is currently being made. It's just that Putin has no real resources for a major offensive. Putin has no resources to win at the front lines. And now he is focusing all of his energy and resources on a number of different strategic directions. Direction number one involves launching strikes on various Ukrainian cities, with the primary aim of, through the bitter cold and other harsh methods, instilling a deep sense of fear and widespread panic among the population, the entire Ukrainian population, the people of Ukraine, and forcing Ukrainians to pressure the president of Ukraine, so that he makes all various sorts of concessions and signs a formal peace agreement. Under these specific terms, following which the very existence of Ukraine as a sovereign and independent state would inevitably come to a complete end. This is because surrendering the fortified areas of the Donbas region right now would effectively mean opening the way for a massive military offensive on Ukraine's major cities. In other words, it practically means surrendering. Well, it's almost a step toward capitulation. That's one direction. The second direction is, so to speak, making deals with Trump to have the sanctions lifted. And finally, the third direction is, let's say, to revive domestic policies in Ukraine in such a way as to sow discord within Ukraine. That is, in reality, to create a situation in which political strife and instability begins in Ukraine. And naturally, this will distract forces from fighting the main enemy. So, roughly speaking, these are Putin's strategic objectives. And I think that understanding that these are exactly the plans in all directions, we need to actively work to resist them. That's what I think about this critical situation. Before moving on to answering your questions, I want to say that today at 8:00 p.m. we will have our conversation with Igor Yelenovich Eidman published. In addition to this, we also had another brief conversation with him. This will also be published at the Free Russia Forum, but it is important to note that it's not a duplicate. Along with all of this, conversations with a number of other individuals will be published. you'll see everything. Announcements have been made, the announcements are there, so stay tuned. We will have quite a few premieres today. And as for what will be in the program, in the main part, at 8 o'clock in the evening, we have Igor Valerievich Elman scheduled to appear. By the way, it was quite very interesting and highly substantial. There was a conversation on the sidelines of the forum, if I can put it that way, with Mikhail Ivanovich Krutikin. I think that considering given the truly impressive range of Mikhail Ivanovich's professional expertise, we will certainly try to arrange a series of regular and insightful conversations with him. This is because he is a person who uniquely combines a deep expertise in economics, particularly the oil industry, with a specialized knowledge of the Middle East, specifically focusing on the nation of Iran. Based on everything that I have personally witnessed, everything I have extensively read, and all that I have heard from others, I would certainly venture to say that I simply cannot name any other prominent specialist on Iran who could even begin to be compared to him in the entire field today. Well, we'll see. In general, this is, so to speak, essentially a kind of preview, if you will, of what the future may bring.